So this first talk is really to acquaint us with this guy, Louis Sullivan. So you're going to be reading Kindergarten Chats, and before you get into that, probably good to know a little bit about his background. Now, I want to just remind you that what we're interested in here is really not Louis Sullivan as some major historical figure in architecture. We're interested in this guy for how he got ideas, how he found a position or a theory or a set of ideas that inspired his architectural work. And in fact, this is a guy who had enormous influence on architectural thinking in the 20th century. Probably less credit is given to him than is due. This is the guy who came up with the dictum form follows function. That got chewed on all the way through the 20th century. We're still kind of digesting what it means to think about form following function. But it all started with Louis Sullivan. And many other ideas about architecture in the 20th century really emanated from this guy who was quite a great thinker. So in this first talk, we're trying to roll back and figure out, how did he come to those ideas? Where did they emanate from? Who was he as a human being, and why did he think the way he did? The reason for that is because the whole point of the course is for you to figure out what you think about architecture. What is your position as regards ideas in architecture? So seeing this case study of Louis Sullivan should hopefully give you a model for how someone develops architectural ideas. So let's talk about this guy, Louis Sullivan. He was born in 1856 in Boston, grew up in the Boston area, went to one of the Latin schools in Cambridge, good classical education. If he were choosing a place in America to grow up, a place that's full of ideas, he could not have chosen a better place than the Boston-Cambridge area. This was the era when Emerson and Thoreau and Walt Whitman were all living in Cambridge right there, teaching at Harvard. It was a phenomenally rich period for ideas about democracy, the formulation of America, what it was to be a culture separate from Europe. He, as I said, he had a really good high school education. He was a smart kid. At age 16, he graduates and he goes to college at MIT. Now, this was the very beginning of architectural education in the United States. MIT had just started the first architecture school in the country, and he would have been one of the early classes. They basically had taken faculty from the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris and brought them over to begin this architecture school in Boston. He went there only for a year, not excited about what they were doing really there. Got a little antsy and decided, well, maybe I'll just learn architecture the apprenticeship way, which was the much more common way of becoming an architect. So he went to work for a very well-known architect in Philadelphia named Frank Furness. This was a real crazy man. I mean, he did wild, powerful, emotional kind of architecture in this era, and really, really good architect. So then Sullivan moved to Chicago. He worked for an architect named William LeBaron-Jenny. William LeBaron-Jenny was maybe the kind of opposite of Frank Furness. This was a guy who was very technically savvy, very powerful in the development of early skyscraper buildings, tall buildings in Chicago. Worked there for a short period of time, but then again got a little bit of wanderlust and impatience, and he then decided, okay, well, I'm going to go to the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, the real thing, the sort of highest level of architectural education in the world. It was very, very famous school of architecture at the time. French higher education was the gold standard. There actually is a book, fairly recent one, by David McCullough, called The Great Journey, where he talks about how Americans in this era were going, all of the best and the brightest were going to Paris for their education, whether it was in engineering or in fine arts and painting or in music or in medicine or in architecture. His hero, H.H. Richardson, had gone to the École des Beaux-Arts, so this made a lot of sense. During that time when he was at MIT, just 2 blocks down the street, Richardson had finished Trinity Church, and it was brand new when he went to school there. And I think probably he learned more from Trinity Church than he did from his classes at MIT, but it began to make him very closely associated with Richardson. So the fact Richardson had gone to the École des Beaux-Arts, that seemed a good recommendation for him. Again, he goes there for a year or two and drops out, is not enamored of that education either. Enjoyed his time in Paris though, and comes back to the United States. He never did get a degree in architecture, although he had these various forays studying architecture in a formal way. He moved to Chicago when he came back to the US. This would have been in 1876. He's 20 years old. The Great Fire in Chicago had been in 1873, so they're rebuilding that city like crazy. There's lots of work for architects. There's some very, very good architects practicing in Chicago, so he moves to Chicago. And he begins working for a guy named Dankmar Adler. This would have been maybe not a great design architect, but someone who was a very good businessman, got very prestigious commissions. And he had only worked for Adler for a few years, and Adler realized, this guy's golden. This guy is someone I need to hook up with. So they formed the firm Dankmar and Adler in 1879. He's still in his 20s. Adler is old enough to be his father or older. Adler's already a very successful architect, and it's a very successful firm. And Sullivan is brought in as the primary designer with Adler and Sullivan. So very, very good break at a tender age here. And he begins to make buildings like crazy. Now, it's important to think of what was happening in this era and how those ideas are influencing Sullivan. So as I mentioned, big influence by Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau and Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman wrote Leaves of Grass in this era, a real appreciation of nature. That really resonated with Sullivan. He was very, very charmed by that sort of attitude toward nature. Henry David Thoreau, of course, had left high society in Boston, a good position in a good family, and gone out to Walden Pond and said, I'm eschewing all of that hoity-toity rich society in Boston. I'm going to go out and find a more authentic way of life, one that is more connected to nature, a simpler life, a more rooted life. And he writes Walden Pond about that experience. So Emerson, Thoreau, Whitman, this way of thinking is very influential on Sullivan. He also was very much inspired by this notion of rugged individualism, which was in the latter part of the 19th century in America. Entrepreneurs making businesses, fending for themselves. He loved that attitude, standing on your own 2 feet, kind of can-do attitude, being able to do remarkable things. This is the period where the United States is building the Panama Canal, this phenomenally challenging project, but it's just that can-do attitude. And yes, we can go out there and we can do it. And the West, Chicago, that was really where it emanated from significantly. So they were, all of that influence of the rugged individualists was influential on him. Then it also was a period of the robber barons. It was when the Rockefellers and the Carnegies and the Astors and William Randolph Hearst were making these massive fortunes. And it was definitely a period of the 99% and the 1%. And the 1% were kind of ruling America at the time. And Sullivan was very rebellious against that. He hated those rich fat cats and was not keen on these massive new businesses they were building. He did not like the business aristocracy, which was mainly rooted in the East Coast in New York and Boston, where he left and went out to Chicago. Was not keen on this whole notion of architecture being a vehicle for showing off how rich you are, which was a pretty common thing in architecture in this period. He was very, very negative on a kind of New York decadence, maybe epitomized the very best by the Astors building the Waldorf Astoria, this incredibly lavish hotel, so they could have their big parties and their friends could have their big parties, and there could be this kind of society scene in New York. For him, using architecture to do that was anathema. So we also could think of maybe some parallel figures in this era that had ideas similar to Sullivan, but in different disciplines. I think one that comes to mind would certainly be Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt was exactly the same age as Sullivan. He had grown up in a very wealthy New York family, and there certainly was a temptation on his part to just fit in with that society. But he became very rebellious and went out to the West and the Dakotas and left behind all that effete New York society scene and was looking for something more authentic, more rugged, more real than all of that scene back there. Another example might be Jane Addams, who actually was a friend of his in Chicago. She started Hull House. She got all the society women and all the poor immigrant women to talk to each other. And in a way, it was about the wealthy women helping out the immigrant women, but she saw it just as much as the immigrant women helping out the rich women to get a little more rooted, a little more grounded, a little more real. And so she was an influence in Chicago that in social life was very parallel to these attitudes that Sullivan held. And then the third figure, again in Chicago, was a guy named John Dewey. John Dewey was, for education, what Sullivan was for architecture. Sullivan had this classical education where you learned Latin and Greek, and that was how you had a good education in this era. John Dewey rebelled against classical education like Sullivan rebelled against classical architecture. What the heck does that have to do with America and with our own life and with a new continent and democracy? So John Dewey said, bunk with all that classical education, and he taught a very pragmatic way of educating students. He called it organicism. Sullivan and Wright would call their thinking organic architecture sometimes. They were using the same word because they were talking in the same circles. And this notion of organic education or organic architecture was that it was rooted in practical things. So in Dewey's mind, the way you learned chemistry was you did cooking. You could see how heat and how different chemicals reacted and transformed, and that was a practical way of learning chemistry. Or you learned biology by going out and observing nature, and then even looking at it at a microscopic level, and you did it by a kind of pragmatic testing. Things that we see as absolutely mainstream in education now, but would have been very different from this hands-off classical education, which was prominent at the time. And Dewey had the same love of Chicago that Sullivan got very quickly. He said, Chicago is the place to make your space and create things in a way that's absolutely based on opportunity. He just saw so many possibilities in Chicago for a new way of life, a new way of thinking. And Sullivan very much saw that in terms of architecture as well. So in the next talk, we're going to be looking at how these ideas got played out in the work that Sullivan did, and maybe the specific ideas he espoused. But in the meantime, read Kindergarten Chats. I will warn you, it's quirky. The writing style is eccentric. It gives you a very good window into the kind of personality that Sullivan had. But muddle through that, it's definitely worth it. There are powerful, amazing ideas that Sullivan's putting down on paper in that work. Kindergarten Chats would have been written when Sullivan was a mature architect. He had done a substantial amount of work. They were serialized initially and then brought into the book in 1918. They would have been written primarily when Sullivan was in his 50s, but not brought into a book until he was 62. And then he lived until he was 68 and died in Chicago. So in the next talk, we'll look at the work. See ya.